Marcus Hale had not slept properly in 4 years, 3 months and 11 days. Not since the night his wife Dina closed her eyes in a hospital bed that smelled of antiseptic and lavender, and never opened them again. He had counted the days the way some men count money, obsessively and without comfort, because counting gave the grief a shape, and shapes were easier to carry than fog. He was 37 years old and he felt like 60. His hands, once smooth from a career in accounting, were now cracked and calloused from the handyman work he'd taken up to keep the lights on in the small house on Garfield Street. The house where his daughter Lily slept every night with a stuffed rabbit named Captain and a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. She was 9. She believed her father could fix anything. She was in most ways entirely correct. Marcus could fix a leaking pipe, a broken fence, a shattered garbage disposal, a fractured carburetor on an ancient lawnmower. What he could not fix was the hole that Dina had left behind, or the bank account that hovered perpetually 3 weeks from disaster, or the feeling that crept into him every Sunday evening, when the house was too quiet, and the future felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in absolute darkness. He had no savings. He had no family nearby. He had a 2009 Ford pickup with a slow oil leak, a stack of overdue utility bills held together by a rubber band in the kitchen drawer, and a daughter who still believed, with the holy and uncomplicated faith of a child, that everything was going to be okay. He could not bear to be the one to teach her otherwise. It was a Thursday in late October when Gerald Foss called. Marcus almost didn't answer. He was elbow-deep under the sink in a rental property on Maple, trying to coax a corroded pipe, coupling back into submission, and his phone was buzzing in his back pocket like an angry hornet. He recognized the number, Gerald Foss, 79 years old, widower, former mechanical engineer, owner of 14 acres on the west edge of Dunmore County, a man Marcus had done odd jobs for over the past 2 years. Gerald was particular, demanding, and occasionally infuriating in the way that brilliant old men often are. He also paid on time and tipped generously at Christmas, which placed him in the highest tier of Marcus's client hierarchy. Marcus answered the call, with his free hand, the other still wrestling with the coupling. Gerald's voice came through immediately, no greeting, no preamble, just 4 words delivered in the low, controlled tone of a man who had spent decades giving instructions to engineers and expecting them to be followed without question. Come to the property. A pause then, don't tell anyone. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans and said he'd be there by 2. Gerald said fine and hung up. Marcus stood in the kitchen of the rental unit for a long moment looking at nothing, then finished the pipe job, packed his tools and drove west. Gerald's property was the kind of place that took the breath gently. 14 acres of rolling land, studded with old oak trees. A farmhouse that had been updated carefully over the decades, but still retained the bones of something built in 1941, a barn that listed slightly to the left, 2 outbuildings Marcus had helped roof the previous spring, and a long gravel drive that crunched under tires like breaking glass. Gerald was waiting on the front porch when Marcus pulled up, wearing a canvas jacket and holding a thermos of coffee with both hands he did not wave. He watched Marcus park and climb out, and then he stepped off the porch and walked directly toward the barn without a word, which Marcus understood to mean he should follow. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay, machine oil, and something underneath those smells, something older and faintly sweet, like a memory of gasoline. Natural light fell in long pale shafts through gaps in the siding, illuminating spinning motes of dust. Gerald walked to the far end of the barn, past a rusting tractor, past stacked wooden crates, past a wall of pegboard, hung with tools arranged with the precision of a man who had been an engineer, and stopped in front of a large shape in the corner, something vast and angular, and completely covered by a canvas, tarp the color of old mustard. The shape beneath it was unmistakably a car, a large one. Gerald reached out and gripped the edge of the tarp but did not yet pull it. He turned to look at Marcus. His eyes were sharp, careful, and carrying something Marcus could not immediately name. Not pride, not grief, but something balanced exactly between the two. "I'm going to show you something," Gerald said. "And then I'm going to make you an offer. And I need you to listen to the whole offer before you say a single word." Marcus nodded. Gerald pulled the tarp. What was underneath stopped Marcus's breathing for a full 3 seconds. It was a BMW, massive, muscular, clearly decades old, with the unmistakable presence of something that had once been extraordinary. Even under the gray film of 22 years of dust and disuse, even with the tires flat and cracked, even with surface rust creeping along the lower body panels like orange lace, even sitting completely still in the corner of an old barn in a county that most people drove through without stopping, even then it commanded the space. It was a 1985 BMW M635CSi, finished in what had once been Polaris silver metallic, a color that in the right light looked almost like moon water. The coupe body was long and low, the Hofmeister kink in the rear window glass unmistakable, the kidney grilles choked with dust but structurally intact. The hood was closed. All the glass appeared unbroken. Marcus walked toward it slowly, the way a person walks toward something they are afraid might disappear if approached too quickly. He ran one finger along the rear quarter panel, and the dust came away in a line, revealing silver-gray metal beneath. He crouched by the rear wheel. The tire was a ruin, but the wheel itself, a period-correct BBS basket weave, appeared straight and true. He stood back up. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest. "How long?" he asked, forgetting he was supposed to wait. Gerald didn't reprimand him. 22 years, he said. "This November." Marcus looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the car. "It belonged to my son," he said. The name of Gerald's son was Paul. He had been 31 when he died, and the BMW M635CSi had been his most prized possession, purchased used in 1998 from a collector in Charlottesville, Virginia. With money Paul had saved across 4 years of working as a machinist, and living on a budget that left no room for anything except this dream. He had driven it for 3 years with a devotion Marcus could only understand in comparison to his own feelings about Lily, the sort of love that was specific and large and entirely unironic. Paul had kept meticulous records, changed the oil every 4,000 miles, kept it garaged in winter, touched up paint chips with a brush, so fine it might have belonged to a portrait painter. And then Paul had gone on a February night to help Akalchi, whose car was stuck in a ditch on Route 9, and a truck coming over the hill had taken him entirely and completely from the world. And Gerald had pushed the BMW into the corner of the barn the following week and covered it and not looked at it again for 22 years. Gerald said all of this, standing very still beside the car, speaking in the measured, even tone of a man who has told a story enough times inside his own head that it no longer required emotion to deliver, only accuracy. When he finished, he took a long drink from his thermos and looked at Marcus and said, "I'm dying." Marcus said nothing. "Prostate cancer. Stage 4. They tell me I have between 4 and 8 months. I believe them." He set the thermos on the hood of the BMW in the dust. "I have been thinking about what to do with this car for 3 years now. I cannot sell it. I cannot donate it. I cannot drive it. I haven't driven anything in 2 years. What I want," he said, each word separated slightly from the next, "is to hear it run one more time before I die." He looked directly at Marcus. "I want to hear Paul's car running, under power, the way it sounded when he drove it up this driveway the day he brought it home." He paused. "Get it running, and I will give you $10 million. The silence in the barn after those words was the specific kind of silence that exists when something enormous has just been said and the air around it hasn't caught up yet. Marcus stood very still. He was not a man given to dramatic reactions. 4 years of single parenthood had burned most of that out of him, but his mind was doing things he couldn't entirely control. $10 million was a number that didn't live in his life. It existed in the same abstract category as space travel or ancient civilizations, real, theoretically, but not adjacent to anything Marcus actually touched. He thought of Lily, immediately and completely, the way he always did when anything of consequence happened. He thought of the rubber band around the utility bills. He thought of the oil leak in the truck. He thought of the hospital copays still sitting on his credit card from Dina's last 2 weeks. He thought of Lily's college, which was 9 years away and might as well have been on another planet. He thought of the crescent moon nightlight and the stuffed rabbit named Captain. He breathed. Then he walked around the car slowly, all the way around, looking at everything. The undercarriage from the angle the barn's light allowed, the engine hood, the condition of the body seams, the state of the rubber around the windows. He crouched. He stood. He crouched again. He put his hand flat on the roof and felt nothing but cold metal and dust and the faint vibration of his own pulse. He stood up and looked at Gerald. "I'm not a restoration specialist," Marcus said. "I know that," Gerald replied. "You're a man who can figure things out, and you don't give up." That's worth more to me right now than a specialist with a business card. Marcus looked at the car one more time. Then he said, "Tell me everything you know about its condition when you put it away." What Gerald knew was this. In February of 2001, when the BMW had last run, it was mechanically complete and largely functional with one significant known issue. The fuel pump had been making a noise Paul had mentioned intending to address and had not yet gotten to before he died. Everything else at that time had been operational. The engine, a 3.5-liter inline-six producing 286 horsepower in European specification, fed by Bosch mechanical fuel injection, connected to a 5-speed Getrag gearbox, had been running. The cooling system had been running. The electrical system had been running. 22 years of sitting, however, was its own kind of violence. Fuel varnish in every line and component. Rubber seals and hoses gone brittle or collapsed entirely. Brake fluid turned to moisture-laden sludge, the battery long dead. Oil turned to a dark, thick paste. Coolant either evaporated or degraded to something that would destroy an aluminum head faster than running the engine dry. The tires, dangerous even to put weight on, let alone inflate. The brake calipers, certainly seized. The fuel tank, a strong possibility of internal rust or sediment that would destroy any new fuel pump within minutes if not addressed. Marcus had restored exactly 0 vehicles in his life. He had, however, rebuilt a vintage lawnmower engine from parts, replaced the entire brake system on his own truck, rewired a rental property's electrical panel, and once, in a moment that had become minor legend among his clients, diagnosed and repaired a neighbor's 1970 International Harvester tractor using only YouTube, a service manual he'd found at a library book sale, and 2 weekends of stubborn, relentless effort. He was not trained. He was something Gerald apparently valued more. He was determined, mechanically intuitive, and constitutionally unable to leave a broken thing alone. Marcus sat in his truck in Gerald's driveway for 22 minutes after the conversation ended, engine running, hands on the wheel, not going anywhere. He thought about practical realities. He had handyman clients to maintain, income he could not simply abandon. He had Lily to pick up from school every day at 3:15. And to feed dinner and to help with her reading homework, and to tuck in at 9 with the rabbit and the nightlight. He had no shop, no professional tools for this kind of work, no part sourcing experience for a 30-year-old German car. He had no guarantee the car could be made to run at all. Regardless of his effort, it was possible, genuinely possible, that after 22 years, something inside that engine was beyond recovery. He also had sitting in his kitchen in a rubber band, overdue bills totaling slightly more than $2,000. He also had a daughter who deserved a future he currently could not build for her. He also had, somewhere deep in the architecture of who he was, the thing Gerald had apparently seen and bet $10 million on, the absolute inability to look at something broken and simply walk away. He called Lily's after-school program and extended her enrollment for the next 2 months. He called his 2 most important handyman clients and rescheduled 2 weeks of work. He drove back to Gerald's barn. He pulled the tarp completely off the car and folded it and set it aside. He opened the hood. He stood over the engine for a long time in the late October light, looking at everything, beginning to understand what he was dealing with. Then he took out his phone, opened a notebook app, and started making a list. The first thing Marcus did was nothing. This was a discipline that did not come naturally to him, but one he had learned through hard experience. The instinct to immediately begin taking things apart was precisely the instinct most likely to turn a complicated problem into an impossible one. So for the first 3 days, he observed. He photographed every component of the engine bay, every hose connection, every wire routing, every vacuum line, every bracket and clamp and seal he could see, creating a photographic record of the car's state before any of it was disturbed. He cross-referenced his photos against a factory workshop manual he located. After 6 hours of searching, through an online BMW enthusiast community called the M6 board, where a member named Horst in Stuttgart had scanned and uploaded a complete E24 workshop manual that Marcus downloaded and printed at the library in 3 separate trips because the file was too large for one session. He also posted in the forum himself, cautiously, and without disclosing anything about Gerald or the money, simply identifying himself as someone attempting to revive a 1985 M635CSi that had sat for 22 years and asking for the community's collective wisdom about the most critical issues to address first. The response was immediate, voluminous, and characterized by the specific passionate generosity of people who love something and are delighted to find someone else willing to love it too. A member called Alpina Bob, who turned out to be an actual retired BMW mechanic in New Hampshire, sent Marcus a private message within an hour that laid out, in organized and practical detail, exactly the sequence of steps he should follow. Do not attempt to start the engine. Do not turn the crank. Do not apply power to anything. Begin with a complete fluid assessment, and do not move forward until every fluid in every system has been replaced or confirmed safe. Marcus printed Alpina Bob's message and taped it to the wall of the barn beside the car. He worked on the BMW in the mornings before his abbreviated handyman schedule, and in the evenings after Lily was asleep, driving the 40 minutes each way to Gerald's property, with a thermos of black coffee, and whatever tools the day's task required. Gerald left him alone entirely, which Marcus appreciated. The old man appeared occasionally in the doorway of the barn, a silhouette in the late afternoon light, thermos in hand, and watched for a few minutes without speaking, then disappeared back into the house. They had an arrangement. Marcus would provide weekly written updates on progress and parts costs. Gerald would reimburse immediately and ask no questions about timeline. The arrangement suited both of them. Marcus drained the oil first. It came out in slow, dark, almost gelatinous ropes that looked and smelled like the thing that oil becomes. When all the useful properties have long since departed, he sent a sample to an engine analysis lab. Something Alpina Bob had strongly recommended, and the results came back confirming no catastrophic wear metals, which meant the engine, whatever else was wrong with it, had not been eating itself from the inside during its long sleep. This was Marcus wrote in his update to Gerald that week, the best news possible. Gerald responded with a single line, Paul always changed his oil on time. The cooling system was a different matter. When Marcus removed the upper radiator hose, what came out was not coolant but a rust-brown liquid with the consistency and color of very old tea, carrying with it flakes of something Marcus did not want to think about. He flushed the system 4 times with distilled water. Before what came out began to approximate something neutral, he pressure tested the cooling system with a gauge borrowed from a friend's shop. It held pressure. The radiator miraculously appeared sound. He replaced every hose, everyone, without exception, with new old stock or high-quality reproduction parts. He sourced through an enthusiast parts supplier in Pennsylvania that Alpina Bob recommended. The fuel system was, as Marcus had feared, the most significant challenge. The tank, when he dropped it from the car, a 2-hour job performed lying on a creeper on Gerald's barn floor, with the cold coming up through the concrete and into his spine, was heavy with rust sediment and the varnished residue of fuel that had spent 2 decades decomposing. The smell when he opened the tank was thick, sharp, and ancient. He sent it to a fuel tank restoration specialist in Ohio, a one-man operation he found through the forum, a man named Carl, who apparently had restored more than 400 vintage European fuel tanks and had a 16-week waiting list. Marcus called Carl directly, explained the situation, omitting the $10 million but conveying the time sensitivity, honestly, and Carl, after a pause, said he could fit the tank into his schedule in 3 weeks if Marcus shipped it that day. Marcus shipped it that day. While the tank was away, he turned his attention to the fuel injection system, the mechanical injection that fed the inline 6. It was a system Marcus had never worked on before, and it was deeply, fascinatingly complex, the kind of engineering that reminded him why people had once called German cars over-engineered with a reverence that exceeded any criticism. He spent 2 full evenings simply reading about how the system worked before he touched anything. When he did begin to work on it, he worked with the methodical patience of someone who has accepted that speed is not available to him, and precision is the only tool that matters. He cleaned the fuel distributor, replaced the injector seals, flow tested each injector, a process Alpina Bob had walked him through in a phone call that lasted 2.5 hours, and found 3 that were either stuck or severely degraded. He sourced replacements. He replaced the fuel pump, which, as Gerald had said, had been a known issue even when Paul was alive. It was during the 5th week, on a Tuesday night in late November, that something happened Marcus had not anticipated and had no framework for. He was lying under the car, inspecting the brake lines, when he heard footsteps in the barn, Not Gerald's measured, deliberate tread, but lighter ones. He slid out from under the car to find Gerald standing not in the doorway but right beside the BMW, one hand resting on the front fender, with a familiarity that Marcus had not seen before. Gerald wasn't looking at the engine or the undercarriage, or any of the things Marcus had been cataloging and fixing. He was looking at the driver's door, just looking at it. His hand was flat on the fender, the way you put your hand on a person's shoulder, not to examine them, but just to be in contact. Marcus stood up quietly, and said nothing, which felt like the correct response. Gerald stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he said without turning, he used to whistle when he drove. He didn't know he was doing it, I think. Just drove and whistled. He removed his hand from the fender. He was a good man, better than me in most of the ways that matter. He turned and walked out of the barn. Marcus looked at the car for a long moment, then he got back under it and continued working on the brake lines. But something had changed in the quality of what he was doing. It had taken on a weight that was no longer about money, or at least not only about money. It was about something Gerald could not buy, and Marcus could not sell, which was the sound of a thing that had mattered to someone, returning to the world. By the 9th week, the BMW was nearly there. Marcus had replaced or rebuilt every component of every fluid system. The cooling system held clean coolant at the correct concentration, pressure tested and verified. The fuel tank had come back from Carl in Ohio, beautifully cleaned and sealed, reinstalled with new sending unit, and all new fuel lines throughout. The brake system had been entirely rebuilt. All 4 calipers removed, disassembled, cleaned, resealed, reinstalled, new pads on all corners, new rotors on the front. Lines flushed with fresh fluid and bleed tested until the pedal was firm and confident. The electrical system, the thing Marcus had feared most, had turned out to be, with 2 significant exceptions, surprisingly intact. The wiring harness, protected by the barn for 22 years, showed no rodent damage and minimal degradation at the connector points. Marcus cleaned every ground connection, replaced the fusible links, installed a fresh battery, and methodically tested each circuit against the factory wiring diagrams. The 2 exceptions were the alternator, which had seized internally and needed replacement, and the instrument cluster, 2 of whose gauges had stopped functioning, the fuel gauge and the coolant temperature gauge, both of which Marcus considered non-negotiable for safe operation, and both of which were addressed by sending the cluster to an instrument restorations specialist Marcus found through the forum. The cluster came back looking, in the forum members' words who had referred the specialist, like it left Munich last week. The tires were the last safety item. 4 new Michelin Pilot Sport Classics in the correct period specification, mounted and balanced at a shop in Dunmore, whose owner, a man named Pete, had asked no questions about the car, when Marcus had arrived with 4 bare rims and simply done the job and expressed, quietly, that whatever was on those rims must be something special. Marcus had said yes. It is the morning Marcus decided to attempt. The first start was a Saturday in early January. He had chosen Saturday because Lily was at a sleepover at her friend Cass's house, and he would not be needed until noon, which gave him 3 hours. Enough time for what he hoped would happen, and enough time to absorb the outcome if it did not. He had told Gerald the night before, tomorrow morning. Gerald had looked at him for a long moment and said, "I'll be in the house. Come get me when you're ready." He had not asked for odds. Marcus arrived at the barn at 7 in the morning, when the air was the specific cold of January in that county, the kind that enters through every layer and lives in your joints. He had slept 4 hours. He had made coffee twice in the night, stood in his kitchen both times looking at the utility bills, which were no longer overdue because Gerald's parts reimbursements had allowed him to stay current, and thought about nothing and everything simultaneously. In the barn, he went through his pre-start checklist one final time. Oil level correct, coolant level correct, fuel 20 liters of fresh premium in the tank, battery voltage 12.6 volts, all fluid caps and hoses secured, fuel lines prime pressured by cycling the ignition twice without cranking. He could hear the fuel pump running, a healthy, consistent hum that stopped when the system reached pressure. He checked for fuel smell, none outside the system. He checked under the car one final time for any drips, none. He stood up. He stood beside the car for a moment in the cold and the quiet of the barn. He thought about Paul, who had bought this car on a machinist's savings and driven it whistling. He thought about Gerald, waiting in the house. He thought about Lily, and the nightlight, and the rubber band, and the future. He got in the car. The interior was the only place Marcus had not fully worked on. He had cleaned it respectfully, but it remained in original time-worn condition. The leather of the driver's seat was cracked along the bolster, in the way that leather cracks when it has been slept in and lived in and loved. The steering wheel was slightly shiny at the grip positions. The gauges were all in the correct position. Now, needles pointing straight down to their resting points, ready to move. Marcus adjusted the seat, which still moved on its tracks. He had lubricated them. 2 weeks earlier, he put both hands on the steering wheel and held it. He turned the key to the first position. The gauges swept through their self-check. He turned it to the second position. He could hear the fuel pump running its final pressurization. He held a breath. He was not entirely aware of holding. He turned the key to the start position. The starter motor engaged, strong, immediate, no hesitation, and the inline six barked once sharply, like something startled from a very long sleep, and then caught. It caught, and it ran. Rough, initially. Rough and lumpy and uneven as the stale air in the intake cleared, and the fuel injection system found its calibration, and the oil pressure climbed from 0 to operational, but it ran. The idle smoothed over the first 40 seconds, gradually and then decisively, settling into something that was not perfect, but was unmistakably purposeful. The coolant temperature needle rose slowly toward its operating range. The oil pressure gauge held firm in the green band. Marcus watched every gauge. He listened to every note the engine produced. He was breathing again. He did not know when he had started again, but he was. He went to get Gerald. He walked across the cold yard from the barn to the farmhouse, and knocked on the back door, which Gerald answered. Within 15 seconds, coat already on, thermos in hand, as though he had been standing in the kitchen waiting. Marcus said only, "It's running." Gerald looked at him. Something moved across the old man's face, a complex layered movement, the way water moves over stones of different sizes. He said nothing. He walked past Marcus across the yard toward the barn. Marcus followed. When they reached the barn door, Gerald stopped with one hand on the doorframe. The engine was audible from outside. That inline six firing on all cylinders, the exhaust note coming through the original manifolds and pipes, a sound that was deep and purposeful and entirely specific to this car and this engine, and no other combination on earth. Gerald stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and listened. He stood there for a very long time, long enough for the engine temperature to reach full operating range, long enough for the idle to smooth completely into the refined, purposeful note the engine had been designed to produce, long enough for something in Gerald Foss, something that had been sealed and tarped, and placed in a corner for 22 years, to shift, gently and irrevocably, into a position that was not healed but was different from before. He had asked to hear Paul's car running. He was hearing Paul's car running. Marcus stood beside him and said nothing, and let the sound do the only thing it could do, which was exist, completely and without apology, in the cold January air of a barn on 14 acres at the edge of Dunmore County. Then Gerald put down his thermos on the barn floor, very carefully, and covered his face with both hands. Marcus looked at the running car, and gave the old man the dignity of not being watched. When Gerald finally lowered his hands, his eyes were dry, but something behind them had changed permanently. He picked up his thermos. He looked at Marcus. "He would have liked you," Gerald said. "I think," Marcus said. "I would have liked him." Gerald nodded. "Come to my office Monday morning. I'll have the paperwork ready." He picked up the thermos, turned, and walked back across the yard to the house. Marcus stood in the barn alone with the running engine, and the dust motes spinning in the winter light, and the sound of a thing restored. And he thought of Lily, and the nightlight, and all the mornings still ahead of them, and he let himself, for the first time in 4 years, 3 months, and some odd number of days, believe without condition that everything was going to be okay.